A good use for offcuts and scrap wood is to make a cutting board. So this year my 3 sons are getting cutting boards for Christmas, and in this episode I'll show you how to make a simple cutting board and an easy way to use the handheld router and cut in a juice groove. The first step in making a cutting board is selecting the wood. I'm using scrap wood for this project, and you want to use a hard wood when you're making a cutting board, so avoid woods like pine or Douglas fir. For this project I'm using walnut, cherry, sapele, and maple. Next, cut your boards to a rough length. I'm making the cutting boards 16 inches wide, so I'll rough cut the boards at 16.5. I want the cutting boards to be 1 inch thick, so over at the table saw, I'll resaw the boards a little heavier than 1 inch, and then I'll rip the boards to width. Since I'm using scrap wood, the width of each board is going to be random, so it's good to have some kind of pattern in mind while you're making these cuts. After cutting the parts to length, width, and thickness, the next step was to come up with some type of a pattern that would fit within my desired dimensions of about 16 by 14 to 14.5. Since I'm making the cutting boards out of scrap wood, the pattern on each board is going to be a little bit different. In this case, I've got a fairly wide piece of walnut in the center, then a thin piece of maple, a piece of sapele, then back to walnut, then cherry, and then walnut again. With all the parts cut to size, I'm ready to glue them up. To help keep the boards flush during the glue up, I'm using what are called cawls. This is a piece of 3/4 inch plywood about 3 inches wide, and I've wrapped the outside with packing tape to keep the glue from sticking to them. A little painter's tape will keep the glue off the clamps, and I've elevated the clamps off the table to make room for the cawls. After putting down a good bead of Titebond 3, I'll use a brush to spread it around. That's good. After clamping the boards together, I'll use a plastic putty knife and a wet rag to remove most of the glue squeeze out. I've allowed the glue to set up overnight. Now I can remove the clamps and sand the cutting board. The glue squeeze out will clog up your sandpaper, so it's a good idea to use a chisel or a scraper to remove as much of the glue squeeze out as you can before you start sanding. Now generally, I would use my wide belt sander for sanding a cutting board like this, but since not everyone has a wide belt sander in their shop, I thought I'd show you how I like to sand a cutting board using a belt sander. First, I've clamped the board to my work table. That'll keep the cutting board from moving towards me while I sand it. I've got 80 grit paper in the sander, and I'm going to sand across the grain first. That'll remove more material faster and help to keep the cutting board flat. After sanding across the grain in both directions, I'll sand the cutting board with the grain to remove the scratches. Now that I have the cutting boards sanded, I'll use my crosscut sled to cut them to length. I'll clean up one side and then set up a stop block and cut them all at 16 inches. Next, I'll cut the cutting boards to width at 14 inches, taking off an equal amount from each side. I'm cutting a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I'll use as a guide to cut the juice groove. I've cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood 5 3/4 of an inch smaller than the cutting board. I'll place the plywood on the cutting board with an even reveal on all 4 sides and hold it in place with double stick mounting tape. This will be my guide for the nose bit in the router. You'll need to keep pressure against the plywood guide as you make this cut. Going around the corners can be a little tricky, so take a few practice runs on a piece of scrap wood before working on your project. For an added design element, I've set up a stop block on the miter saw and I'll cut a 45-degree angle at each corner. Next, I'll use a small roundover bit in the router to soften up the edge on the top and bottom. Okay, well, I'm real happy with the way these turned out, and definitely a good use for scrap wood, and I know my sons are really going to enjoy these and put them to good use. The food safe finish that I used on the boards is board wax from my friends over at SoulCal Wood Shop. This is a really nice finish, very easy to use. It's what I use on all my cutting boards and wooden spoons, and I'll put a link to their Instagram down in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this project, and thanks for watching.